Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, the aftermath of a wild 6 hours in South Korean politics.
From crisis to celebration in a matter of hours. South Koreans poured onto the streets after the President Yoon Suk-yeol backed down, reversing his decision to impose martial law.
First, martial law was called, then it was called off. What's next for South Korea and its president, Yoon Suk-yeol? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
Hi, my name is Se-Woong. I'm a journalist and founder of Korea Exposé, a media startup based in Seoul, South Korea.
Welcome to The Take, Se-Woong. A lot has happened in South Korea.
President Yoon Suk-yeol has declared martial law. He made the unexpected announcement in a late-night television address.
But shortly after, members of parliament, including some from his own party, voted to block that move. So effectively, nothing has changed and everything has changed. Walk me through the political whiplash of the 6-hour period between Yoon declaring martial law and then calling it off.
I guess whiplash is a good way to put it. Yeah, I mean, first of all, the fact that we're hearing this phrase martial law in the context of Korea is bizarre enough. And I'm sure that you've heard people describe it purely as stunning. The sense of shock also for me is it's something that is very difficult to describe. The last time martial law was imposed in Korea was about 45 years ago. And Korea, of course, transitioned to full electoral democracy in 1987. And just like you and everybody else, I believe this is a stable democracy. We have rule of law, we have institutions that safeguard our rights, and then, bam, this happens.
친애하는 국민 여러분, 저는 북한
Dear
공산 세력의
citizens,
위협으로부터
I hereby declare an emergency meeting to protect the Republic of Korea from the threats of the North Korean Communist forces and to protect the freedom and happiness of our people.
비상계엄을 선포합니다.
I think martial law is a word that not many people are familiar with what it actually means. You might hear it tossed around, you might see it in history books, but what did it mean for that 6 hours and what could it have meant going forward?
So there was actually a text circulated by what is called the Martial Law Command. So that's the branch of the military that was supposed to enforce rule. And three things that really stood out to me when I was looking at this text. One is a ban on all political activities within the country, and that included any kind of legislative activities. So the government or the president was saying that now the National Assembly, which is the parliament, is not allowed to engage in politics. And then there was also suspension of freedom of press. And also there was a very specific clause at the end that said, if you violate the terms of martial law, you can be arrested, detained, and searched without warrant.
So were people seeing tanks and special forces and soldiers out in the streets?
So these are actually the images that went through my mind, obviously, when I read through this text. Right? And then, in fact, on social media, we started to see pictures of armed military vehicles rolling down the streets of Seoul. They were later proven to be fake. But the fact that it was so believable to those who were seeing these pictures, I think really gives you a very good sense of the mood.
Yeah. So those were faked. What was real, and perhaps just as unbelievable, is seeing lawmakers at the National Assembly inside and then seeing that there be barricades of furniture because whether or not they were inside or outside, whether they had permission to be and wanting to vote on this to undeclare this martial law, all of that was happening in a very short period of time.
Yeah, so the president declared martial law on a televised address at about 10:40 p.m. And right after that, lawmakers started to gather on this island called Yeouido, which is where the National Assembly building actually is. And as far as we know, the members of the ruling party, that's the party of the president, they were also concerned, but they actually did not go to the parliament building. But it's the 190 lawmakers from the opposition who did. And already there were buses after buses from the police barricading the main gate of the complex so that nobody could enter.
Wow.
And we have seen videos, live videos posted by some of these lawmakers who climbed over the fence of the parliament complex in order to enter the building without being caught by the police.
Oh my gosh. And then protesters also showed up at some point.
Yeah, people definitely started to gather. I had some friends messaging me saying they were on the ground watching what is going on. And then what made it even more incredible is that military helicopters started to show up. They were flying over the building. And then these special forces soldiers started appearing on the ground, all ready to storm the building. And that's really something that just goes against any kind of image of Korea that I think Koreans themselves had. The lawmakers started climbing over the fence to get inside the building. And then the special forces stormed the building, right? They were breaking windows to get inside. And then you had parliamentary aides spraying the soldiers with fire extinguisher, trying to keep them out.
Lawmakers rushed to the National Assembly where the Speaker of Parliament declared the martial law announcement invalid.
And then the National Assembly managed to vote to end martial law.
Legislators early on Wednesday voted to reject it.
What happened next?
That's the funny thing. Zero reaction from the president. People are thinking, okay, National Assembly made its will very clear. This is being broadcast on live TV. The guy must have gotten the message. And then he says nothing, right? And then the speaker is like, okay, so I guess you didn't get the message. So we're going to send the signed physical document over to you now.
Wow.
And even after that, like hours and hours of silence, and or finally at 4:30 a.m., he comes out and says, okay, now I respect the will of the legislature. Thank you, everybody. But in fact, like people ask, why did it fail? Like, how is it that the president declares martial law? And then 6 hours later, he's like, okay, that's over. Bye-bye now. But in fact, what he himself probably did not expect is how unenthusiastic the armed forces would be. And also the police too. They didn't want to hurt people or kill people. The orders came from the top. So they tried to follow to the best extent without actually being held accountable for any kind of serious consequences. So that's really what this government and the president did not anticipate. And that's why this martial law basically failed.
Wow. Oh, that's really interesting context there. That begs the question. I've seen some headlines and reports floating around today of the word coup. What do you make of that word in this context?
Well, so the important distinction between a coup and imposing martial law is whether it's constitutional or not. And in fact, I think we can argue that the way the president imposed martial law was itself unconstitutional because he was obligated to inform the legislature the moment this happened. And he was on TV so people could watch it, but he did not have their consent. And he actually tried to prevent the legislature from voting against it.
Now the conversation has moved on to impeachment. So on Wednesday, the opposition party demanded Yoon resign. He didn't. They then submitted an impeachment bill. So could he be impeached?
Well, I mean, Korea already impeached one president, and that was only 8 years ago.
Right.
So constitutionally, this is completely possible. And right now, the opposition is controlling the National Assembly. They have about 191 seats out of 300. What they need to pass the impeachment motion is to have 200 votes, so 2/3. But if there are any defections from the ruling party, and it's very possible that there would be, then in fact the impeachment motion would move to the next stage, which is to be ruled on by the Constitutional Court. There's a little bit of a hiccup because the Constitutional Court normally has 9 justices. Right now, 3 of those seats are vacant. And to have a quorum, you need at least 7 justices to be presiding over any kind of ruling. So can they do that with 6? Or do they need to appoint more justices? National Assembly will elect new justices, but the appointment has to be done by none other than the president himself.
With what you're explaining about the declaration of martial law being unconstitutional, at least in the way that it was done, do you think that will be part of the impeachment proceedings if they happen?
For sure. The word that is going around the political landscape in Korea at the moment is insurrection. Right? So we use the word coup, but the way people would like to prefer to describe the events of last night is as one of insurrection, in that he basically rose up against the authority of the constitutionally determined institutions and the Constitution itself.
So what happens when the president leaves office? That's after the break. Tell me a little bit about the president. He was elected in 2022 very narrowly, and it seems like his popularity has been declining ever since. Perhaps most famously, there was the scandal with his wife and a handbag. We've covered it here on The Take.
The Dior bag scandal erupted after a video surfaced showing a South Korean-born American pastor, Choi Jang-young, giving the South Korean First Lady a Dior bag reportedly worth $2,200.
What else should we know about President Yoon?
I think it's important to know what a character he is. He's had such an interesting career, starting out as a prosecutor. And in fact, the reason he became popular is because he stood up against people in power. So as a prosecutor, he's taken on cases that implicated members of the political elite or confidant of the president. And for that reason, he was actually demoted and sent away. But later on, he also gained recognition for his what appeared to be acts of courage. So let me just recap here. So 2017, there was a major political scandal in Korea over corruption in the presidential office. That president, Park Geun-hye, she was impeached.
President Park Geun-hye, who has been mired in a massive power abuse scandal, has been removed from office. She is no longer the president of Korea.
And then opposition candidate became the president. And that new president appointed Yoon Suk-yeol, the current president, to be the prosecutor general of the entire country. So for a guy that had a reputation for being difficult and, pardon me for saying so, pissing off people in power, he really made a real comeback that nobody expected until he picked a big fight with the very president who appointed him for going after the confidant of that new president.
Oh my gosh.
So he resigned and then he said, I'm going to run for the presidency. And that's how he got elected in 2022.
Since then, how have people felt he's done?
So Korea, like many countries around the world today, is politically deeply divided. And that really speaks to how he did win the presidency in 2022, but by a margin of about 1%. And in the beginning, at the very least, I'm sure his supporters, including my parents who voted for him, felt that this is a real change. Finally, the leftists or progressives are out of power, and a true conservative is now running the country. And then, as you said, these scandals, right? And then it just went downhill from there.
So I wonder what your parents thought of the events that unfolded overnight as someone who voted for him.
Wow. We're really opening a big can of worms here because actually I get asked a lot. The president, when he gave that televised address and said, we are imposing martial law because we are under threat from North Korea. And people are asking me, like, does he really believe in that? Is this really true? And I say, well, there are Koreans who really believe this is happening. They believe what he said. And that includes people like my parents. Yeah. And in fact, when I talked to them on the phone, they were like, why did he stop? Why didn't he go further? And I'm like, what do you mean? And my father says, if you're going to impose martial law, you need to do something with that and finally get those enemies of the country out of the way.
So earlier, Se-Woong, you touched on the element of North Korea that the president brought up in his initial speech in which he was declaring martial law. And he said he was protecting South Korea from North Korean communist forces and protecting the, quote, free constitutional order. You've already mentioned that some people at least believe that this is true. Where does this come from? And can you talk to me about the truth?
Well, we need to walk back a few decades and look at the beginning of the Republic of Korea, which is the official name of South Korea. Right? Korea was divided after the Second World War. The US forces occupied the South, the Russian forces or Soviet forces occupied the North. And subsequently, in 1948, we saw the founding of two different countries. That is the Democratic Republic in the North, the Republic of Korea in the South. And at least in the southern part, the beginning was not very pretty. There was corruption, there was dictatorship, there was poverty. But a lot of these problems could be justified by pointing the fingers at the North. Look at them, the communists, with the support of the Soviet Union. They are there constantly waiting for an opportunity to take over. We need to defend ourselves. We need unity. Otherwise, our democracy will die. And that rhetoric for decades, including during the military dictatorship in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, proved to be very powerful. And for people like my parents who really grew up with this whole history, the idea that communists are there and threatening us, it resonates as real.
Yeah. Well, there are members of the opposition who are, at least on record, open about wanting to create more of a diplomatic channel with North Korea. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. It's this is sort of the real policy difference between what are called Korean conservatives and the Korean progressives. The left side of the political spectrum, they do want to try something different with North Korea. And that's certainly what we saw with the president who was in power before Yoon Suk-yeol was elected in 2022. Of course, it didn't really work out. And now we're back to this game of threats and missiles and all that. So there you go.
Yeah. I read reports that even though it was late at night and many people were sleeping, others, upon hearing about the imposition of martial law, were worried and were figuring out how to then stockpile up on goods, canned goods, instant noodles, worrying about packing a go bag. Have you heard stories like that?
I have seen the pictures and I've heard the stories, but I think we have to accept the simple reality that a lot of people weren't sleeping. Right?
Yeah.
I think there's a reason why the martial law was imposed so late in the evening.
Please tell us why. After 11 p.m. local time.
Yeah.
Why?
I mean, partly because people sleep. Well, I mean, problem is in Korea, we have such a late night culture. Like a friend of mine messaged me as this was happening and like, I was at a company dinner and we were at karaoke and then we got the news. And now, like, we're debating, do we take the subway or not? And right?
Dinner and then karaoke on a Tuesday night.
This is Korea. But, I mean, people like my parents, they were definitely sleeping. They had no idea until they woke up the next day.
Yeah. Well, let's talk politically as we wrap up here. What happens if President Yoon leaves office by his own will or otherwise?
If he leaves, then there will be a new unscheduled election. There will be about a 2 months period until the next election can take place. And during that time, the prime minister will become acting president.
Okay.
Apart from the fact that the entire cabinet said they have the intention to resign, there are many, many stumbling blocks, and I'm sure we're going to see this drag out for weeks and months to come.
Yeah. Well, finally, Se-Woong, this does seem like a situation where the stakes are very high. How could what's happening in South Korea affect other parts of the world?
Well, there have been reports that Washington has been deeply concerned about what was going on. They didn't want to come out actively and say, please stop this nonsense. But at the same time, they communicated enough concern to the South Korean side to let them know, we're not going to judge you explicitly, but can you please back down? South Korea hosts the biggest U.S. military base outside the U.S. territories. And also, Washington has been pushing very hard for South Korea to play nice with Japan so that there can be a more united front in the region when it comes to combating the influence of, let's say, China or Russia. And now all this is in question.
What are these next 24, 36, 48 hours going to look like for you? What will you be doing?
Giving lots of interviews, I guess, and writing, just monitoring, because I am also curious how they're going to overcome this particular challenge. The events 8 years ago were very dramatic. People really didn't quite believe 100% that this could lead to the result that they were hoping for, right? Peaceful, democratic transition of power and punishing those who are corrupt. And that is basically what happened. So I have hope that things this time will also work out in a positive fashion. But Koreans themselves often joke, our country is dynamic. That was the tourism office tagline, dynamic Korea. And I think Korea certainly proved to the world just how dynamic it is.
And that's The Take. We're always listening to what you think of the show. Let us know what kind of episodes you'd like to hear more of and what you thought of this one. We do read the comments, so go ahead and put your thoughts below and we'll check them out. I'll see you tomorrow.